Hello, everyone, and welcome to our session of Amaze at Pop. Yes, I know it's a lot of acronyms, but they've become terms of endearment to us. Amaze is Ask Me Anything Enterprise, and Pop is the summit we've been at for the last 2 days. Before moving on, I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. We have attendees from across the world attending today, so if a land acknowledgement is something you do in your home country, we invite you to share one from the region you are joining us from in the chat. If this practice is new to you, we challenge you to take some time to learn about the traditional keepers of the land where you are. I'm going to add a link in the chat so that you can look into it. My name is Alya Jinah, and I will be the moderator for today's session. I work at the Trico Foundation Social Entrepreneurship Center at the School of Business. So today we have an interactive session for you. So we encourage you to turn on your camera, and when called to do so, please also open up your mic so we can hear you. We're also recording this session for future reference. Ask Me Anything About Social Entrepreneurship is a collaboration between the organizations represented by our panelists, namely the Trico Charitable Foundation, ABC, and Innovate Calgary, and obviously the Haskins School of Business. And we are thrilled that you're here with us today. As a reminder, though the panel represents many years of experience within social enterprise and its ecosystem, we would like to remind you that this is not legal advice. Without further ado, allow me to introduce the panelists. First, we have Jordana Armstrong, Associate Director, Clinical and Social Innovation at Innovate Calgary. Next, I'd like to introduce you to Brittni Kerluke, Manager of Capacity Building, and Dan Overall, Executive Director at the Trico Charitable Foundation. The Trico Charitable Foundation seeks to close gaps in society by provoking innovation and building capacity in social entrepreneurship. And finally, we have Christine Spottiswood of ABC, which is Alberta Social Economy Ecosystem Development. The ABC is a collaborative of social enterprise and finance leaders seeking to develop a strong social economic ecosystem in Alberta. So my first question for our panel today is, we've had a jam-packed, filled couple of days. Some of you have been panelists, some of you have been moderators, some of you have been audience members. I would like to invite the panel to share what is, maybe it might be hard, what is one thing that has struck you the most from Pivot on Purpose? Who would like to start?
I can jump in. So hi, folks. Nice to see everyone, and nice to see familiar faces in the crowd. And hopefully we get to see your faces for those of you folks who are still have your videos off. But so I think one of the things that I have really taken away from this is that there are so many people doing really, really interesting work and at a very high level of sophistication in Alberta. And so it was really exciting to be on a panel with some rising stars in Alberta, some social entrepreneurs yesterday who told their stories, and having seen just like such growth in the way that they are approaching social enterprise, solving social problems, and then the diversity of problems that the innovators in our province are solving. So I think sometimes we talk about this a lot, but we need to get better as a community of telling stories of the fantastic work that's happening. It was really inspiring and incredible. So I think one of the things that I'll take away from POP is just a lot of gratitude for bringing some of these voices together and giving folks a platform to share their stories and to have folks like us learn from that.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jordana. Christine, over to you.
Yeah, I'll kind of reiterate that, Jordana. The thing I think I've enjoyed the most is getting to know some of the social enterprises and hearing their stories and hearing them talk. Just with the work that I do, I actually don't get to spend a ton of time talking directly to social enterprises as much as I would like to. And so I think that's been my favorite part so far, is just some of them I wasn't aware of, and the sessions were long enough that I really feel like I got to know their journey and what they were up against. And it was just, it's a great perspective. And I think that was my favorite part.
Jump in. Yeah. So it's been really interesting, just from the lens of seeing sort of 2019 to 2020 when we last did this event and a number of these awards, and seeing how some of the players are still in the space, and really seeing how they've evolved and they've grown over those 2 years. I think that there's been amazing stories, and the connection between, you know, a lot of those challenges that maybe those newer student enterprises are having that are very similar to those more mature social enterprises, and some of those core tools and skills that bridge across those conversations I have found just very fascinating, and really just excited to see organizations as they progressed over the last 2 years, and looking forward to the next couple of years with them.
So I certainly echo all of that, but in doing this collaboration with Haskane, and Haskane being so great, their initial draft of describing this event was a social enterprise event. And we said, you know, thank you for the sentiment, but no, focus on the intention and the purpose, which is reimagining business models to solve social problems. And I'm so glad that we took that direction, because it's not about the label. It's about what you're wanting to do with these concepts. So I'm so glad that we opened it up, the conversation, to, there were so many definitions of social entrepreneurship, so many different perspectives, so many different labels, but to actually focus the conversation on what we're trying to accomplish, I think is going to be the key for us. So I'm so happy that we did that.
That's such an interesting point, Dan, because today I was creating a Jamboard for another session, and an older one from when we were talking about pop and what it would be, even the name, what we were envisioning came up. So just to see the transition, the arc it's taken us over the last 11 months is really nice to see, and to see how we grew and how we had an opportunity to collaborate with other teams at Haskane and across the country, like with SOUF, the Social Enterprise World Forum. So yeah, thank you. Since this is an interactive session, please either come off the mic or put your questions in the chat, and I will call upon you to elaborate or to share your questions. So please, the floor is yours.
Can I start? Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. So probably this session is probably going to be the most interactive, because it's like ask anything and everything about the social enterprise. So for me, it's like I'm trying to explore this whole sphere of social entrepreneurship, and seems like this is the right forum. Though I am based in Doha in Qatar, but I am looking for anything new which comes in the world of social entrepreneurship, where the role of the institutions like University of Calgary as an example, and this Business Management Institute, for example, right, along with the Trico Charitable Foundation, right? How does, through this session, you collaborate with the new entrants, or those who are looking for these avenues to join, right? Because ultimately you realize that this is an area which works closely with the business and with your purpose as well, as a collaboration of your purpose with the business. So how does that work through this session? That's my question. And is it like it's easy, it's difficult? Does it require some sort of background, or does it require some sort of passion around it? So maybe it's like too many questions in one question, but I thought, let me put it in the whole perspective, because my purpose to join this 3-day session is primarily coming behind that. Actually, that's the whole idea for me to join this whole 3-day session with you guys.
Thanks, Mohammed. Can I ask a little bit of a clarifying question? So you mentioned the institution you're from. What what angle are you coming into this from? Like, how much experience do you have in this space? And are you coming from the lens of sort of just being curious to learn, or are you trying to think about what you can do in your own community to support this kind of work?
So just to clarify where I'm coming from, that I have been into this on behalf of my organization, right? I work for a multinational bank for the last 20 years. So I come from a background where through the sustainability initiative by the organization, right, I work closely with community on financial literacy as an example, or anything which helps, our customers to make things sustainable in their space of work. So that's like I have been all along throughout part of the journey, apart from my job, right? So now when I realized there is something happening like this, which is specific to the social entrepreneurship. So I thought this is where the experts will be there. Let's join this, let's hear from them. And then show my purpose of joining this session is to step into this world in a bit formal manner, and then explore myself as the next part of my journey in this space, right? And that's where I look at, like, you have an institution which is Trico, you have educational institution which is your University of Calgary and all. So how does it work for the new entrants into this? With, of course, there's a background, I have experience, and I have a passion around it. So how does that marriage happens?
Well, I'll just say first, welcome. And I think that is what I'm understanding. The purpose of this type of conversation is to really get to the meat of what people are curious about in the space, and then to make those connections and collaborations and have a layered conversation which isn't experts sort of talking at folks, but really like us coming together as groups who are, to Dan's point earlier, really interested in the outcomes of what the people that we're trying to serve are creating. So that would be kind of my short take on it, which is just welcome. And I think that is the exact point of this conversation today. And maybe we can dig more into throughout the conversation, sort of, what you've learned over the conference and sort of what you might be taking back to your community. I also just want to give the POP team an opportunity to kind of chime in, maybe around the purpose of bringing Ask Me Anything into the end of the conference as a way to kind of wrap up.
Okay, thank you.
Dan, do you want to take that one?
Why we brought Ask Me Anything into POP, it just seemed a really natural fit. I mean, part of the challenge in working with anybody in this space, whether they're newcomers or vets, there's different levels of conversation, but we also were finding that people just wanted to be able to ask very, very basic questions and have a conversation. So that's why we just literally called it Ask Me Anything, to just start those conversations. And the good thing is, not only is it kind of like this watering hole where we can have these conversations, but if you have a specific interest or challenge, we're hoping that by bringing in the network together, we can then plug you into wherever you need to go. So for example, there's all kinds of newcomers, right? In the sense of, are you a newcomer in terms of wanting to fund social enterprises? Are you a newcomer who wants to be a social enterprise? Are you a newcomer who just wants to study social enterprise, right? So there's all these nuances to a conversation that itself is very varied and nuanced. So this is just the beginnings. And I guess to just build on that, what's great about a maze is, as you see, it's now plugging in some key stakeholders in the ecosystem who have had ongoing relationships and are actually developing something like ABC, which itself is this kind of gathering of the ecosystem to start having conversations about where the gaps are, how can we be better in working together, how can we map stuff. So there's all these pieces to the conversation. So that then you can kind of hear the buffet, and then based on what your particular interest in, we can have that conversation and start plugging you into what particularly resonates with you.
Great, Dan. I think you touched all the 3 points, which is like in which form I'm interested, right? And that's where this platform will help me definitely to build upon later on that how I am trying to get into this space. So be it like creating something new or joining something which is already existing. And third is like if there is a route of some joining the institutions, for example, Calgary University or Trico, in terms of gaining knowledge, right? By doing certain courses, short-term, long-term, right? I'll be really interested and keen for that. So maybe over this course, when I hear most of you guys, maybe I'll try to build up and then connect subsequently. It will be really great help for me.
That's wonderful.
Thank you.
I'll just jump in really quick because I do feel like I should probably contribute to this particular question. So ABC is doing the broader ecosystem work or trying to help connect and convene and really answer that it's a really interesting question, one that's been on my radar and that I've been asked a couple of times recently. So right now my answer is I welcome you to just shoot me an email, and I have a lot of just one-on-one conversations with people like yourself, and then as best I can help connect them and direct them as much as possible. And then in the new year, I do have kind of in the works some community conversations that I wanted that are just going to be public facing opportunities to join and have conversations that so that's something that I'm working on right now. So in the meantime, while we get some of that stuff a little bit more sorted out, I really do just welcome people to shoot me an email, and I'm happy to set up a quick introductory call and see if I can help get you connected to the people that you want to see.
Thanks, Christian. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Colton, you've had your hand up for a little while, so let's go over to you.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Alya. And thanks everyone for being on this panel. It's been a great summit so far. I've really enjoyed it. Lots of really great learnings from a lot of different perspectives too. So it's always nice to see. I have to apologize. My question is going to be a little more on the, I guess, research side. I come from more of a research background, so it might not be quite as application focused as Mohammed's question. So thanks for that question, Mohammed. It was nice to hear some of that. But I'm wondering a little bit about this idea of ESG and corporate responsibility. It's always been it's been an increasingly important draw for talent into organizations, right? For employee recruitment and getting top talent. But I feel like especially since the COVID pandemic, there's been, they talk about this great resignation. It's occurring in the States, and that's starting to come to Canada. And, it's not as much people just going out of work, but more making transitions, right? They're trying to find that alignment between their values and find that alignment with companies and what the company's purpose is. So I'm wondering, especially in the last, year or two, have we seen an increase in top talent move into more of like the social enterprise or social entrepreneurship space? Like, are we seeing that trend happening? What does it sort of look like from the standpoint of social enterprise and social entrepreneurship with this labor adjustment going on? And I don't necessarily mean from a research background either. I don't need stats. I just mean, like, have you seen it in your guys' daily interactions? Like, what have you guys been seeing as you kind of go forward?
Brittni, do you want to start on this one?
I don't know about top talent. Honestly, it's not really where I'm focused. I work with a lot of entrepreneurs on the ground. What I am seeing is a lot of students' interest in this and a lot of students that are really looking to have an impact with their future, whether they're starting their own organization or interest in joining an organization where they're having some sort of impact. And just sort of this idea of, business can ingrain the social piece in it, right? And then the other piece is that we're seeing a lot of interest in existing organizations that maybe are thinking, how do we use markets, for example, to move our social impact? So I do a lot of work with nonprofits and charitable organizations that are looking at this piece. Somebody else might sort of be more wanting to talk about like industry professionals, just not who I work with. So.
Yeah, I can jump in there. So we have been noticing, at least again, anecdotally in our experience running student incubator programs, just increased numbers of student demand to work with social enterprises. And that was a thesis that we sort of validated from looking at stats around young people increasingly demanding jobs that align to their values. And I don't think that that was something that was new since COVID. That had been happening for sort of like years prior to that. And then I think the other thing that's really important is that when we think about what talent needs to be going forward, 2016 World Economic Forum released a report on the future of work, and they talked about things like critical thinking, ability to work with people, and a bunch of different other factors that you can really draw out of people through entrepreneurship, whether those folks end up starting their own businesses or they go off to be intrapreneurs or they go off to work in various jobs at different size organizations and companies. And so I think for me, social entrepreneurship has always been this really interesting training ground to really future-proof sort of the next generation of talent, but it's also one that seems to align to what young people are demanding. So yeah, that's anecdotally and sort of a little bit of the program logic behind some of the stuff that we've been doing over the last couple of years. And then, like I said, that was a thesis we had when we first launched a number of programs specifically focused on youth, but we're now proving out that thesis with increased demand and certainly a lot more demand than spots we can fill. Anything to add? I know there's some actual folks on the call as well that might have some comments there. I'm kind of thinking about if James Stotch is if he's listening, he might have some comments. But Dan, you want to go ahead?
That would be great to see if there's expertise in the audience. We're here to also learn from you. So please, if you feel like you can add to the conversation, please do.
I'm certainly noticing a growth in the trend as well, but echoing kind of what Tariq Fancy was saying about his nasty surprise when he started embracing ESG as a funder. There's this, used to be this comedian, Groucho Marx, who had something along the lines of saying, honesty, integrity are crucial. If you can fake that, you've got it made. And there's going to be this challenge of, is this talk real? And of course, if it's not, there's going to be like this huge backlash. And my fear is, if there's this backlash, it's not that they're going to blame it on concepts like ESG or social entrepreneurship, or sorry, if there's a backlash, they're not going to blame it on themselves in being disingenuous. They're going to blame it on the concepts, right? So we have this weird kind of, figuring out what we're really about of, is this talk real and how do we kind of make it real? And I don't think that has played out fully in terms of it's sounding good that there's momentum, but are the businesses that are doing this really about this, or have they simply heard they're not going to get their employees if they don't embrace this stuff? So definitely there's momentum, but I think there's a deeper conversation that's going to need to play out.
Just really quick on that, actually, Daniel, a quick follow-up. So do you think then that there's potentially the opportunity that like social enterprise or social entrepreneurship that evolves more into that enterprise space, would that be more competitive in that space of not sort of, I don't know, when you look at some, some companies, corporate responsibility, like documents or their promises, it's kind of them trying to like it's following this trend, right? And it might be that disingenuous piece of, just trying to find something to kind of fit the general social conversation without there truly being that connection. But when I look at social enterprise and social entrepreneurship, it's something that's baked into the model, right? And even hearing some of the successful social enterprise owners and founders that we've throughout this whole summit, a big thing that's come out is that you're not necessarily even really selling on that piece, right? I mean, it's baked into the system and you're having an impact, but you still have to do what you're doing well, right? You're still providing value for customers, you're competing in an industry, you're doing what you do well, like I just said. So it's is that potentially more competitive in that space of attracting talent where people can kind of see through the weeds of, well, okay, that this might just be some sort of facade around purpose versus something that's actually ingrained into a company? Like, is that opportunity emerging? And maybe that's a self-answering question, but I just want to see your thoughts.
So I answer with a quote, and I'm going to try to make this the last time I do this. So F. Scott Fitzgerald said, a true sign of a first-rate intelligence is being able to hold contradictory thoughts and still function. I feel that again, there's these two conversations, and I love the point you made, because I'm seeing this conversation a lot in a sense of, hey, you know what? Purpose, societal purpose is where the money is at. Like, you're going to survive and thrive more if you do that. Now, that's very compelling, and I think we need to get behind it. But there's part of me that's going, the reason we're having this conversation is not that we can make more money by focusing on social good. So I want to maintain that conversation because it is powerful, but I also want to nurture another conversation that says sometimes making less money and doing more good is okay. And oh, by the way, the definition of capitalism does allow you to do that and still be consistent with being an entrepreneur in capitalism. So if we could maintain these two conversations, I'd prefer that, because again, I really worry that if we just sign on to, hey, let's do good because it makes more money, we're just perpetuating in a new way the slavery that we have to maximizing profits, right? It's old wine in new bottles, as people say.
And I'm going to be contrarian and see if Dan agrees or disagrees. And again, it's like holding that tension of almost saying something similar with, like, you know, the opposite of the coin. But thinking about like old wine, new bottle, I also think that sometimes we think about social enterprise and it feels like quite complicated. We can get into tools, we can get into frameworks, we can look at case studies. But actually, when we boil it down, I think you kind of said it, Colton, you know, the social impact is embedded in what the entrepreneur is trying to do. And if we take a step back and we think about what businesses have historically done, you know, generations ago, many businesses, and actually many businesses still today that aren't considered, maybe wouldn't call themselves social enterprises, are embedded in communities and are solving problems within their communities and might be hiring locally. And so business, I think, you know, has evolved to have big business has evolved to have a focus on shareholder value. But I think if we like peel it back and think about first principles, what are we trying to achieve here? And that's where I see like an evolution from something like corporate social responsibility into shared value as sort of one of those things that makes me feel a little bit confident that at least we are moving in the right direction, because at the end of the day, those corporations are still focused on shareholder value, but that concept of shared value, looking at sort of what issues that relate to environment, social governance factors actually, you know, support that bottom line with while also supporting communities. Not to say that all of that is like, none of that is greenwashing, none of that is kind of social washing. I think that still happens in a big way and is something we have to be aware of. But I think when we really look at what we're trying to do, that's where I see the promise of social enterprise, is that, you know, you really are focused on that blended mission. And I think that's kind of inspiring and exciting, kind of as evidenced by some of the folks we've seen throughout this weekend.
I just want to add sort of the piece of, I mean, there's different ways to have impact, right? And I think everybody kind of wants to be like, this is how you're a social entrepreneur, this is how you have impact, and this is a better way than this way. And really, it's up to the organizations to own their own journey and figure out what is the impact that I want to have and what is the best way for me to have that impact. And I think that's a really important conversation in terms of, you know, there's no one way to do this. That what makes sense is what makes sense for your organization. And the other thing is that it's going to evolve, it's going to change. And so maybe the way that an organization is having impact day one, you're kind of like, I don't know about this. But 10 years down the line, they might be doing the coolest things. And I think sort of this idea of creativity and creation, we were just in the Freeman session, right? But this idea of, you know, how do you push creativity and how do you sort of see win-wins and have these conversations is really key. And what is really exciting impact for me, or for what I would be looking for in a job, is probably not the same as what it would be for you.
Can I just pick up on two threads? One is what Jordana was saying, and I absolutely agree. In fact, if you look at a lot of the conversation about social entrepreneurship, it reflects the origins of business were definitely about purpose, right? And business in a way has kind of lost its way. But the additional intriguing nuance to build on what Trico was saying about the ESG and the financing. So why is BlackRock now starting to focus on more social issues? Funds are getting so big that they're not invested in one company, they're invested in all companies, which now means they need society to thrive. So there's this new nuance where big finance has gotten so big that it needs societies to thrive. And that's actually been a key driver and an intriguing nuance and element to this conversation of, will finance eventually get it and actually focus more on society prospering? Because now it's become the only route to their success, because they're invested in everything.
I love that point, Dan.
Colton, any follow-up questions to what you just learned?
Well, there's so much to talk about, but I think that's good for now. I might jump in a little bit later, but I'll give maybe some other people a chance to talk. But thank you guys. That's excellent. Lots of great insights there.
Alrighty, we're ready for the next question. I got a note in the chat saying, oh, here's one. Who or what is your favorite example of a social entrepreneurship and why?
Oh, Ida, you rock star.
Dan, you want to start?
Oh, Ida's soft pitching me, so I'll let others talk. But thank you for doing that, Ida.
Christine.
So it's funny because I'm like, oh, don't call on me first, because, and it's, I've asked this question to a lot of people recently, and they often have a hard time answering it, usually because they have a hard time. The word favorite can be really difficult because there's lots of different, and I'm actually like thinking through some of the ones that I saw today, and I like to publicly state a favorite. I'm not sure that's such a soft pitch, Dan. Like, I'm like intimidated by this question. What is your favorite example of social entrepreneurship and why? I can't believe I'm going to cop out and say I can't pick a favorite because I get really mad when people do that. You know what?
And say we'll come back to you, so you have a minute to think.
No, I'll give an example, and I'll say this one not because it's my favorite, but because it's front of mind. But I'm going to come back to the Edmonton, and forgive me because I'm going to butcher I don't remember the names of everything, but the mattress recycling contract that they had with the city of Edmonton, where they would actually get with the dump, and they would go to the dump and get the mattresses, and people who are more familiar with this one, please jump in. And then recycle the pieces of the mattresses. And I liked it specifically because it solved, and then they hired specific demographics to do the program, and it solved so many problems. Like, there was no waste anywhere in it. Every piece that program touched solved a problem. It didn't create a problem. It didn't have that charity piece. It was like a win-win-win-win-win all the way around. And it's, to me, like, that's it working at its prime. So
Christine, I share your sentiment because it's an unfair question to say favorite, but I think I can reframe, what becomes my favorite is typically like the type of approach. And there are so many organizations that fall under this bucket. I actually see some of them on this call today. So I'll speak to a couple of different examples to contextualize, but I really like the amount of creativity social entrepreneurs can bring to embedding impact in various aspects of their model. And in particular, when there is something like really beautiful or magic about the alignment between their business model and scaling their impact. And I know that the folks at Trico talk a lot about that and kind of solutions to kind of arrive at that place. But one example, from a tech perspective, there's a company out of New York, they're called BioLite. They sell clean cook stoves, but their cook stove has proprietary technology that converts cooking heat into electricity. So they're actually able to bring electricity to all of these unelectrified areas off grid, which is quite powerful from an international development perspective. But what's really neat about their business model is that the technology actually has great applicability to kind of Western, like camp and outdoor enthusiast markets. So they actually were able to build enough cash flow in their business by selling these at a high market rate in North America. And it's called the camp stove. But then in order to subsidize being able to scale this product in developing markets where their margins were actually a lot thinner, but they had a larger opportunity, they could access more people, they use that cash flow to kind of subsidize the scaling of this in developing markets. And so I like that example because there is a true alignment, kind of the concept I mentioned earlier of shared value, but there's an alignment between the impact that they're creating and every stove that they deploy. In particular, this is amplified in the international development context where the power of that access to electricity is just really quite amazing. But I think there's a local charity nonprofit that is launching a social enterprise here in Alberta, Immigrant Services Calgary, similar story. So Immigrant Services Calgary had an interpretation and translation center. It was formerly run as a program, and they realized that there was actually consulting services that they could provide to large organizations, large corporations, different levels of government. So they basically used to offer translation interpretation services to new immigrants for things like translating licenses or being accompanied to different professional services. But they started to realize that actually major corporations need translation services, and major corporations also need to understand the context of the language that they're translating. And they also have this value add around understanding those communities and what does like brand messaging look like in those communities as well. And so they've taken something that was previously a social service, building on their assets and their capabilities as an organization, now developing a revenue stream around that. And guess what? They're layering on top more impact by hiring women who are new immigrants to Alberta to actually be employed in the translation services and start their own interpretation and translation businesses. So there's that layering and kind of overlap between what they're doing from a revenue model and what they're trying to do from an impact perspective as well.
So I'm not gonna name my favorite organization because I think Dan might name it, and I think he'd do a better job of explaining it. But I want to go back to this idea of how there's no one way to impact and how it can evolve over time. And one of the things that we did, and I think is really interesting, is Dan had gone around and was talking to a number of professors in this space, and was sort of trying to get to the root of how they understood social entrepreneurship. And he asked them about their favorite social enterprise. And one of the ones that was named was 10 Trees. And at the time, what 10 Trees does is, at the time, what they were doing was you buy a t-shirt, we plant a tree. And at the time, we would talk to organizations and someone would be like, I'm so excited about this example. And then somebody else would be like, that is not social enterprise. And I think that's where the different ways of impact and the definition stuff becomes really interesting. But what's really cool about that organization is at the time, I was like, it's probably not my favorite example of social entrepreneurship, but there's this really cool evolution of what this organization has done. And they've grown massively over a number of years. They're selling different products, but what they've done is the challenge I had originally with their business was that it's a disconnected model. We talked about the blender in a session yesterday, but it's a disconnected model because you have to be good at two things. You have to be good at creating t-shirts and you have to be good at planting trees. And then on top of that, you might have customers who, one is there because, hey, I really am passionate about planting trees. And then you also might have a customer who's going, I just want a t-shirt. And so you have to play to these different groups and really know two different businesses. And that's really tough, right? Like those pieces can pull against each other and cause pressure points. But what's really cool about 10 Trees now, I don't know, 5, almost 9, 10 years later since we've had these conversations, is 10 Trees has evolved. And so while their model at the time was sort of, I was like, oh, this is a little tricky, now it's evolved and they're actually doing different things. So one is they're actually producing all their t-shirts in more environmentally friendly ways. And that's because that's what the customers were calling for, right? We would like to see those. So they now have some environmental pieces in there. But the other thing is they were actually working with the factories that were producing their goods, and they were planting trees, which then cut down on the energy costs in those factories. And so this is really exciting example of how maybe the model wasn't the most exciting to me back in the day, but it has evolved and it can change over time. And I think that's one of the really powerful and cool things about social enterprise is that you might start off with a tricky model, or the model may not look exactly like where you want it to go, but over time you can start moving up that mountain and start moving towards that vision that you have.
Can I just add a point to that, and then I'll stop being a little monopolizer. But so I love that point, Britt, and I think it's also neat for folks to not be afraid of thinking about the shadow of your impact as well, and the shadow of innovation. And I think it's important to raise in this context, because you told a really nice story of 10 trees and sort of their evolution and pivot towards positive social impact. And I think we can think of examples of organizations as well where you're not listening, thanks, Alex. Well, you're not listening to feedback, and then you're missing opportunities to improve or amplify your impact. And I think one example, not to pick on Tom's shoes, but I, having an international development background, know that there was a lot of conversations, a lot of data that was demonstrating for decades, well, a decade or so, that Tom's shoes had some negative impacts around their business model. And at this point, they have done a great job of sort of moving forward from that and doing capacity building with entrepreneurs. But the buy one, give one model, there's a lot of evidence that shows it undercuts local economies. There are issues around fairness. And so there were some things that could have maybe been corrected earlier on in the model. And it's not to say, don't go out there and try to change the world. It's to say, listen to feedback, and in particular stakeholders who have deep expertise in the areas that you're working in. So just wanted to add that caveat, because sometimes I think we don't talk about that shadow side, and it's important.
Dan, did you want to jump in before we get to the next question?
So I'm afraid that I've told the story about the social enterprise so many times that the people that actually know me are going to want to go for a bathroom break or a coffee or something like that. So I can tell a story, but I'm feeling like really sheepish that some of you have heard this so many times.
We say do it.
Okay. So Phyllis lives in Germany, visually impaired, works in an accounting firm. And although the firm was very nice to her, she knew because of her physical impairment that she was slowing them down, and she felt horrible about this. So apparently in Germany, around the same time, there was a bottleneck where women weren't able to get breast exams. So somebody noticed this and created a social enterprise called Discovering Hands. And what Discovering Hands does is it trains visually impaired women under doctor supervision to provide breast exams. And they also did an independent study about it, and they found that these women who are visually impaired and trained found tissue abnormalities more often, and also found tissue abnormalities that were smaller compared to non-visually impaired doctors. So the magic of this is it's a win-win-win, because the women that weren't getting breast exams are now getting breast exams. Phyllis, who felt like her particular situation was literally a handicap in the accounting firm, is now actually a strength in Discovering Hands. And Discovering Hands itself now has a competitive advantage. Now, the reason I love this story is twofold. One, if you look, it's actually an example where the social enterprise, the social model, is actually a competitive advantage in the market. Because these women are visually impaired, they're able to be better breast examiners. But the second thing is I find this is a metaphor for social entrepreneurship. A lot of social enterprise models are like the accounting firm, which are well-intended, but they're just kind of clunky models. Whereas the Discovering Hands one is where we need to have more of a conversation of where, again, the blend, the social and the entrepreneurial are so connected, it's hard to separate them. And indeed, the social part is, again, the entrepreneurial advantage. And our challenge as a movement is to be inclusive of the accounting type models, because again, they're well-intended. But see if we could also be aspirational and talk more about the Discovering Hands models. I should get money from Discovering Hands for telling the story, I swear.
Someone mentioned in the chat that it's actually similar to Meticulon locally, which hires people on the spectrum for software testing.
That's bang on. It's particular. And again, if we could celebrate more of these ones that have figured out this kind of synergy. Jordana refuses to use the word synergy because she feels it's been used to death, and she might be right. But if we could have about those types of models, I think it would be really powerful for the sector.
So the next question in our chat is, after listening to so many presenters at this summit, I want to ask if people think social enterprise will become more common in the future, and whether this transformation will require more government support. If so, what would that look like?
I'm happy to jump in on this one, Alya. I could probably talk for the next half hour on this one specifically, and Jordana and Brittni and Dan, you're welcome to disagree with me anywhere along the way. My biggest thing with where I come at this one is, one day I hope we stop using the term social enterprise completely, that it stops being a thing, the same way we don't really call a business, an environmental business, a business that has green practices. It just becomes the way of doing business. And I hate butchering stories because like I have like 2/3 of the story in my head, but in terms of the government support piece, I think government support means government buy-in. And I heard this story once, so this is like fifth hand, but the concept is still the same. And it was around the recycled paper, and that when recycled paper first came out, it sucked and it was really bad in the printers. And then government put out a mandate, the government of Alberta, one government put out a mandate that all government offices had to use recycled paper, and everyone hated it because it sucked and it jammed up the printers. But because the buying power was so high, the producers got better and the printers got better, and over the course of time, now you'd have a hard time not finding recycled paper. And so where government has by support, I don't think that specifically means money from government to support social enterprise, but their buying power helps normalize it as just everyday way of doing business. And so that's an opportunity that they have, not the only opportunity, but it's one way that they can really start to normalize that.
Yeah, great question. We get it all the time at the Trico Foundation. We're a bit of a black sheep in the sense that we don't have this long shopping list of things that we're wanting government to do. We actually haven't really found a role per se for government other than bully pulpit, which comes from Theodore Roosevelt, where he would say bully all the time. And it's created this idea of government can kind of influence the conversation by cheering it on. I think that's a huge role for government is kind of encouraging the conversation about this stuff. But so far, technically, we're not opposed to it, but there's so much coming online in terms of supports for social entrepreneurships that we haven't had a chance to figure out what the gaps are and what particularly the role could be in government.
Sorry, I just want to add one more. I've got like 5,000 things I could talk about with this one. I do think municipalities have a lot of power in some of the work they're doing in government mandates and some of that piece, like Scotland and Amsterdam, and some of those have really been driven by legislation or initiatives through the government that have built that support. And so I think that piece is really important too.
I would just say too, I think like as Trico Charitable Foundation, one of the places we've really focused ourselves, even around like social procurement and stuff like that, is how do we actually build capacity in those organizations themselves that are delivering the product? And I think there can be sort of this misinterpretation, I guess, with social entrepreneurship, that somebody will buy your product because it's doing good. And I always use the example of a cup of coffee, right? Somebody might buy your cup of coffee one time, but if it's a crap cup of coffee, nobody's coming back a second time. And so really working with organizations to understand where they are in the market, why their customers there, what customer need they're filling is where we've kind of more focused ourselves. And then the cool thing is if we can build capacity in those organizations so that they are really looking at their price and their quality, but also their social impact, can we then help them if government comes calling, or if a big customer comes calling, can we help them be ready for that opportunity and in order to really leverage it and make it the best that it can be? And so I think that's where we have really focused ourselves is, on the ground, how do we help social entrepreneurs and social enterprises really become as sustainable as possible, or really think about, their blends of how they're bringing the social and entrepreneurial together, so that when those people do come knocking, or hopefully come knocking, they're ready for them.
I think, I guess a fundamental challenge I have relating to government is this stuff is so messy and so new, you can't move forward without experimentation. And for whatever reason, government has now evolved because of the spotlight and politics that it can't experiment, i.e. it can't fail. It can't not produce uber performances and great results. So you can't have like the candor that you need to have the experiments to actually figure stuff out and then kind of move the needle forward. And that's as much our fault as society as government per se.
Absolutely, Dan. And I would just like to add, I think on the government piece, one thing I'm interested in, same with large institutions from a social enterprise perspective, is that buying power. And if Jane Bisbee were here, she would say that government is about procuring services. So when we think about the traditional nonprofit and charitable sector, we often don't view those as social enterprises per se, and we can talk about definitions, but governments procure social services from those organizations. And so I think that there is a piece in sort of reframing the way that we think about what value is at the end of the day, what economic value versus social value is, there's a messy middle there that I think that is a bit underexplored. And then I also just want to say that I think, yes, social enterprise will be the future. And I completely agree with you, Christine. I think I would like to see a future where we don't call it social enterprise. That's just how we do business. But now, having been in this space for a decade, I'm starting to ask myself, and I'd like to ask the broader audience, is it going to be enough? And that's what I wonder. Sort of what does the evolution of our systems look like to truly be equitable and to truly serve a kind of diverse set of folks? And I'm not sure if business is the only tool that will get us there. And so that's something that I've been noodling on lately.
So in case if you allow me to join in this conversation, because of my own organization experience on this particular thing, right? And we connect with the regulator as well on these things. Seems like things are evolving where government will mostly act like a regulator rather than taking part into carving out funds and allocating it. The burden they will pass on to the private sectors mostly. So that means the government will act like a regulator. They'll have certain, regulation around these things and say, okay, this is how it should be applied, which should help the society at large. But the actual player will be the private sector. And that's where the role of the social enterprise will really become more and more important over a period. And there's an awareness generally, right, that if we ignore this now, it will be too late. And that's where there is a pickup. I must say there is a pickup, right? When we go and meet the regulator on these things, they really ask very tough questions to us, that how are you guys doing on those front, right? Rather than just showing how my P&L is working, profit and loss account, right? How my balance sheet is working. But they really focus upon where is your sustainability fund, right? Are you allocating your assets in the right set of, sustainable environment or not? So those kind of conversations are happening at a big pace, I should say, and quite intense these days. So seems like twofold. One is like government primarily will focus more on regulation, and the burden will be mostly on the private sector, and that's where the role of the social enterprises will become bigger gradually. That's my view with my experience, just to add a point.
Thank you. So in the same line of questioning around government support, there's a question around how does an individual actually go about lobbying for change in strategy at the government level? What can we do as individuals? Brittni? Dan?
Nope. So we don't, yeah. I would say no thoughts.
No thoughts. Okay.
There'll be some others who can answer better than us because as implied by Brittni's answer, we don't, as Trico Foundation, really focus on that side of things. But I can make a personal request in that if you are going to be lobbying of government, please do the homework of actually getting the real world story and details, because I've seen so many social entrepreneurship submissions that are based in theory as opposed to really talking to on the ground social enterprises as to what they need or what the challenges are. So please base it in, not in theory, but in reality, and do your homework.
And I would just add, you know, like we have MPs and MLAs for a reason, and they're meant to represent our voices as voting constituents. And so I would utilize those as folks to get to know, to write to. We'll notice that a lot of recent campaigns have, recent political campaigns have had this sort of thread of innovation and entrepreneurship within them. And so I think that there is a bit of an opening to have these dialogues. The responsiveness, I'm also not a social activist, but the responsiveness might vary, and there might be other tactics that you can employ, but I would start with the people who are voted to represent you.
Everyone's like cringing at this question. It's a hard question to have to answer. ABC specifically isn't lobbying government at this point, but I will share that having a collective voice has certainly helped us build a really strong relationship with government, and where they are keen on listening. And I think some of them are actually in the room. So I'm like, this isn't nerve-wracking at all. I think having that collective voice from many organizations, which for those who don't know is the structure of ABC, where we do have a steering committee that represents the broader ecosystem, has helped streamline that process of working with government and bridging that gap. And I do, to Dan's point too, I just caution people, it's really easy to get really excited and then start lobbying for something, but sometimes that can actually work opposing to some of the other work that's being done. So collectively or as a group or finding out who else is doing that work can be really important, because if we start sending mixed messaging to government where you've got two people lobbying maybe for completely different things, it's hard for either to make progress at that point. So, but the idea of, to Jordana, sending a letter to your MLA, simply saying social enterprise is important to you and putting it on their radar as a constituent that's important to you and you want it to be important to them, that alone can be incredibly powerful and I think fairly harmless.
And I think we've got someone from government who might be able to add.
Yeah, so I'll jump in. I've been trying to be very quiet because I'm actually learning quite a bit. So for those of you that don't know me, I'm Desiree Bowlby. I'm the director of the Policy and Strategy Unit in the Ministry of Culture and Status of Women. So to this question very specifically, how you can advocate about social enterprise ideas and needs for Alberta, you'll definitely get your most tuned in ear by going to your local MLAs and asking them to bring it forward. I'd also say, as a public servant, inviting government into these spaces is also like a really great first step. The government of Alberta, our provincial government, has made a commitment, a very public commitment, to want to support Alberta to grow in social innovation and social enterprise. But to answer that very question of what does that look like it's a great question, because we're still trying to figure out what that is. So we can help the sector, like, and even Trico that may not need us or see a role. I'll admit we see a role in helping not only regulate, but also convene conversations and taking feedback to adjust funding and things like that. And then there's, for the nonprofit sector that I work with very closely, there actually are a few tables that convene specifically for advocacy purposes. So the Alberta Nonprofit Network is a table of network stewards from across the province. and looking at what are the policy issues for Alberta, particularly for nonprofits, is a great table. And then as soon as they write government a letter, you get like 4 or 5 ministers that tune their attention to it. Same with the letters from the chamber, the Calgary Chamber of Volunteer Organizations and the Edmonton Chamber. Those are 2 tables as well that have that very close line in to government that can really provide a good ear there as well. But on the simplest side, write your MLA and invite me to conversations. Because we really are on the ground trying to figure out what government's role in the provincial level is in this work, and how do we work with other levels of government. So we do have a cross-jurisdictional committee set up. We are looking at how we can convene closer conversations with the federal government, and then how can we work with municipalities as well to really increase this industry across Alberta. That's a couple thoughts. Hot the press.
I just want to reiterate too, Des, don't forget about your municipal government as well and their councillors. We often think provincial and federal, but there's a lot more tangible work that can sometimes be done at the municipal level, where they have, especially small, like rural municipalities have a ton of flexibility to just play in that space and do something. So don't discount the power of that, and small communities and chambers of commerce too. Like they are awfully closely tied to the municipal governments.
Thank you so much. I noticed in the room we have a lot of people representing or coming to us from other post-secondary institutions. So my question is actually around, or the question I'm thinking I'd like to ask on behalf of those other post-secondary institutions is, what else can we do? What can post-secondary institutions keep doing or start doing to help with this work?
I would say talk to the students and talk to the organizations that they want to work with. I think the piece of really understanding what the needs are, or what has been impactful and what hasn't been impactful is really key. I think it's easy to sort of sit down and decide this is how we're going to teach social entrepreneurship and this is how we're going to go about it, but it's actually a very fluid thing and it doesn't look the same for every organization. And so really talking to them and understanding what their needs are is huge.
So I would say there's the 3 legs to the stool, which is actually why Trico Foundation has been so embedded in working with post-secondary institutions. You teach it, you research it, and you either incubate it or accelerate it, which are like 3 key prongs. And then if you have a conversation with both the sector and other post-secondary institutions as to what you're learning by doing those 3 things, that's going to be incredibly, incredibly powerful. And to Haskane's absolute credit, what part of its vision is for Pivot on Purpose and moving it forward is to build exactly those 4 things.
I had comments, but Dan just stole the cake there, so.
Did he eat it too?
That was a weird analogy. My apologies. Stole the cake, stole the show. Yeah, that's fine.
We do have another question in the chat. Corey says, or Corey, do you want to come off mute and ask your question?
Sure. Oh crap, what happened? Sorry, I did something here. Oh, can you see me?
Yep.
Okay, cool. So I work with a nonprofit called Canada Bridges in Calgary, and we do a lot of work with youth in the city and in surrounding communities. So in Stoney Nakoda, which is where I am from, as well as the Siksika First Nation. And this past year, we've been exploring the idea of social enterprise and entrepreneurship. I think I just actually started with the organization back in April, but I think they've been exploring it longer than since I joined, but this is kind of like a new venture for me, I guess, to go down and my colleague thought that I would be the great person to take on this initiative. So what the question I have is, what is something to think about in terms of the next step? Because I think we're pretty close to figuring out what we actually want to do in terms of social entrepreneurship and how we can make a good impact and like through the social, how do I say this, enterprise. So I guess there's two questions. So one question is like, what is something to think about in terms of a next step, and what, I guess they're both the same question, sorry. Yeah, what can we do to move forward? It's like kind of like my question, because I feel like I personally feel stuck, and I think we're trying to figure out how we can move forward without being stuck. I don't know if that makes sense, but that was my question.
I'll just go. There's a lot of resources out there for you. And it's really determining what your needs are. I'll just do a little pitch. We have a assess program, which is really about helping organizations understand both the social and the entrepreneurial aspects of their venture and how they work together. And so a few of the sort of examples we talked about earlier touch on that work. But I mean, the really interesting sort of place to be is sort of now figuring out, this is what impact we want to have. This is who we think maybe we're going to sell to. And now like exploring, how do those pieces work together and how do we achieve the goals that we want to have? So one of the things we do through the assess program is really look at, how do you move from where you are now to where you want to be as safely and as efficiently as possible, because you want to learn along the way and you want to be responsive along the way, and you want to experiment and pilot and test and do all these things so that you can really stay in like an affordable loss zone, but also that you can evolve your idea as you go. So I'm going to plug our programs, but there's a number of other programs that are available to you, I'm sure. And so also feel free to send an email to us is what I would say, or I'm sure anybody in the panel. So.
I'm just gonna jump in too and add, I've gotten this question a lot, like over the last little bit. We want to start a social enterprise, and without knowing exactly where you are or in that process. The other thing I'm reminded of is, if you were trying to start a business, what would your next step be? And it's not always that vastly different because it's a social enterprise. And that's where we kind of get into that normalizing social impact work as part of our business. That's not always applicable depending on where you are in that process. But I think I've seen people get stopped up by well, I want to start a social enterprise and I don't know how to do that. They may have been people who've actually started businesses before and worked their way through that process and get a little hung up on the social enterprise piece. But there's a lot that just isn't that different, and that you can just start to move forward one step at a time, the same way you would in any other industry or sector. So.
And I would just add, great question, Corey. And I think we're all kind of taking a step back because we're sort of giving each other space to kind of chime in, but really good question. I would ask, so you said you were close to thinking about the route you want to go down. And what do you mean by close? Like, are you at a place where you're ready to launch it? Like, have you started to do, to Brittni's point, like, have you started to kind of talk to potential customers and really figure out, what does that mean, close?
Well, a lot of the times there's other organizations reaching out to our organization for, say, to come speak to a group of youth or to run a session. And I guess one of the ideas was that to start charging a fee so that it'll go back into a pot where we start generating sort of like a little economy kind of thing, that way we kind of give back to go. So how to explain this story? It's like we'll charge a fee to basically, it'll go into a pot, and then eventually sort of, oh my gosh, I'm butchering this. That was one of the ideas, was that to start charging like a fee to come speak to a group of youth, and then that fee will go back into the organization, so that we're able to like continue giving as we're receiving, if that makes sense. Sort of like yeah, so like it's kind of like we're starting this cycle, and that, you know, what we receive, we kind of put it back out into programming or I'd say like a scholarship, for example. If we wanted to do like go down that scholarship route, then that way, you know, we generate from our speaking fees, or that's just an example that I'm using, that it'll go back into this pot of scholarship, and that, you know, yeah, the cycle.
Perfect. So I just have one quick comment, and then I want to circle it back to kind of Britt's comment around like the support that different folks offer, including the Trico Foundation and others. It sounds to me like you're in a place where you're ready to kind of experiment with some of those like approaches, and so you can work with, you know, folks who help design experiments, and to think about that, like test the willingness to pay of those folks, but test it in a way that kind of is suitable for your market. And again, Trico Foundation would be a great place to reach out to kind of work through that test. And then I just think for the group generally, I think starting a business is overwhelming. And a woman a long time ago, Lynn Sutherland with IRAP, really boiled it down to 4 key components that I always find really helpful when working with like a first time or early stage entrepreneur. There's the product or service. What do you have to do to refine or test that product or service? There's the market. So what do you have to do to understand that willingness to pay, understand and refine over time who that early adopter might be, or that customer in the long term? So there's your product or service, there's your market, who's going to pay for it. There's the financial model, like how is this going to work financially? Are there startup costs associated? And then the last piece is the team. And I think in particular, when you're a nonprofit or charity, thinking about social enterprise strategies, thinking about that team that's going to be able to dedicate some time to kind of validating the business model is important. And maybe there are even grants to validate some of this stuff. I don't know. Micro grants, perhaps. And then, of course, as a social enterprise, you're going to layer on top impact. But I think when we come from the world of nonprofit and charity, we are often impact first. And so, yeah, boiling it down into those 4 categories and then thinking how you move those forward is a helpful framework for me.
I would just add on that, and just as we got more clarification on what you're looking at doing is that's a type of model that we see a number of organizations sort of doing. So there's really a lot of opportunity to learn from organizations that have done it before, right? Whether it's organizations or if it's on sort of the industry expertise side of things. So we talk a lot about camaraderie or friendly wise skeptics, sort of having someone who can maybe impart some of that experience. And so that's also another route that a lot of organizations are happy to sit down and have a coffee. Well, not maybe sit down and have a coffee, have a nice virtual coffee with you these days, which is great to learn from somebody who's already done it.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thanks, Corey, for a great question. Any from the audience that want to come off mute? Okay, then I will ask my next one.
Alya, can I be contrarian again? I would just love if any of the social entrepreneurs who are on this call, and I know there are a number of you, are tuned in. I think it would be really neat for one of you to come off the mic and maybe share, like, sort of, you know, what did you do when you first got started? Like, how did you know what to do next with the team and with Corey? And then if not, I won't monopolize, but I think there's some cool folks on this call that could have some opinions.
Am I unmuted? Can you guys hear me? Okay, great. Yeah, I'm I'm not exactly sure. I don't remember the beginning of the question, but I know that everything has been mentioned. We kind of accessed, like we talked to Trico. We didn't actually end up doing the assess program, but we loved what we saw. We just didn't have time for what we were doing to go through that. But Trico was a big help to us in a lot of the conversations. We went to Startup Calgary. We were familiar with, we were already sort of involved in the Startup Calgary community. So, and both of us as co-founders were entrepreneurs in the past. So we had started businesses before, but this was absolutely different. And especially being a for-profit social enterprise, we were in between two traditional funding routes that and didn't fit into either. Like we couldn't get any nonprofit funding, no grants were available to us. And then on the other side, we were going to investors and competing with very traditional high yield investments to try and garner investment from them. So in that way, it's sad that Jane isn't on the call, but Social Enterprise Fund ended up being our absolute biggest supporter and funded Common Good hugely, and was sort of a mentor and just tremendous support in so many different ways other than just funding. And then we accessed also the SVI community, social venture. I can't remember how that, but anyway, out at Hollyhock. And that community became very, very strong for us as well. A lot of resources, oftentimes as it's just reaching out to other entrepreneurs that are doing it, reaching out to the organizations that are out there to assist and to help you. Even talking with our bank, ATB was incredibly helpful. We did the booster campaign to start. That was really not so much for funding as it was for marketing, but it gave us this quick access to the community of Calgary at large, with media coverage and everything right away. So it was a great way to launch. So yeah, we really accessed community in every way that we possibly could. And I think it's important to do that and to have a community like ours that is very supportive. It's fantastic.
Thanks, Dave. I'm so glad you shared some of your thoughts. Some of the work you're doing now is also involved in this area, right? Do you want to mention that for a brief moment?
With Platform Calgary, you're talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's been interesting at Platform. I'm an advisor there now, and so I get to work with tons and tons of startups. And you know, my experience from traditional business, but also in social enterprise, has been really valuable to them. And we're really trying to be as big a community supporter as we can as an organization, and partnering with as many different organizations in the city as possible to deliver programming to startups that is going to help them accelerate. And so we have a ton of free programming available, from mentorship to Startup 101, Funding 101, all kinds of different programming that is really helpful to startups. And I, as now one who's been through social enterprise and through traditional business, and seeing this programming and delivering it to entrepreneurs, I can say it's all spot on, whether you're a social enterprise or a tech startup. So it's been really a great organization to be involved with, and great to be connected in community with them.
Thanks. We have another question in the chat that I think is really interesting. We haven't really talked about this week or this last couple of days. So the question is, it's tempting to see social enterprises as more ethical, but that isn't necessarily true. How do you see the relationship between business ethics and solving societal problems through business models? Who wants to take the first step?
Oh, you missed a huge chance, Ned Freeman, because he's a huge proponent of that. So he would have been great to ask that question. I think social entrepreneurship is all about ethics. Actually, a la Ed Freeman, he thinks business is all about ethics too. But the thing is, we can't assume, right? So yes, it is, but you have to have the deeper conversations to make sure. So I'll cap with my final story. So Eleanor Roosevelt was starting to do tours for her husband, Franklin Roosevelt, who was president at the time, but he was in a wheelchair. So she went to this a government-funded program where they were providing meals to people who were in need. So Eleanor reported back saying, you know, I went to the place and they had the tables and the pots were boiling and steaming and stuff like that, and it looked very active. And Franklin, who was a lot more worldly than Eleanor at the time, says, no, 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 you have to look in the pot to make sure there's actually food in there. So yes, ethics is very much connected to business and social entrepreneurship, but you gotta look in the pot.
Is that a quote? No, it's not. I'm just joking, Dan.
It's a story. I was trying to make the cake.
Yeah. I love this. So I do want to chime in. I think it's so valuable. And when we think about like creating impact through your product or service, that is one way you can create impact, but also through your operations and through your governance. And so I think a woman that I think it was the Trico Center, but some folks got together, perhaps also anyway, some folks got together and brought a woman here from Oxford. Her name is Daniela Poppy Thornton, and she talks about the concept of heropreneurship. And I think that there's a link for me in this, and that link is that we are humans and there's kind of like a human nature. And I still personally grapple with whether human nature is inherently good or bad or somewhere in the middle. It's probably somewhere in the middle, as everything is. And so, but the concept of heropreneurship was that when we talk about social enterprise and social entrepreneurship, as it kind of became really popular and those words started to trend, we almost lost sight as a community, and that's a broad kind of, broad scope community around what we were trying to do. And really what we were trying to do is solve the social problem. And Dan, you teed that up when we first started in asking sort of what has been the takeaway from POP as a conference. It's really putting the social issue back at the center of what we're trying to do and kind of peeling back the layers around, who cares what it is, what we define it as. That's not what you said, but something like that. And so I think when we think about social entrepreneurship and this concept of heropreneurship, it's the individual and the individual's ego put at the center of the social problem, not the social problem, and the actual large community of people and actors around it that are trying to solve it. And so I think there's that same kind of problem that comes up when you think about, the individual social entrepreneur solving a social problem. They're not going to. It really is a collective impact issue, and it really is like a lot of voices and energy and people that need to come together to really change homelessness, even just in Calgary. And so so when I think about like the ethics of social entrepreneurship, I think we're faced with the same dilemma of the human condition and the sometimes nefarious human condition. And then I think that's where you sort of, we end up in greenwashing or social impact washing and that kind of stuff as well. So kind of a good question. Really, really, really good question.
Yeah, I agree. Really, really good question.
I think I just add to that too, is that I think it's an issue whether you're a social enterprise or you're not a social enterprise. You always have another aspect to consider if you're specifically got a social mandate. But I think you can learn a lot from talking to your beneficiaries and talking to your stakeholders and learning from them. Because you'll talk to sort of some maybe social enterprises and stuff like that who are really trying to do great things, but maybe are not going about it in the way that you think. So for example, potentially an organization works with individuals with employment barriers, but they pay them below minimum wage. So they're providing jobs, but they're not paying them the same as their seen to be more able counterparts, right? And so there's sort of this piece around having impact and how you want to have impact and what's core to the organization. And those are really powerful conversations to have, whether there's a social piece or there's not a social piece explicitly. I mean, those are conversations that every organization is going to have. How do we pay our people? What do we pay our people, right?
Thank you so much. Yeah, such a thought-provoking question. More on the on the philosophy level than the how-to level, which is interesting to have right now. Colton has our last question. So Colton, over to you.
Awesome, thank you. Hi everyone, I'm back again. Sorry, I had to step away for a little bit, so I apologize if this is already been asked, but I'm gonna ask it anyway. Jordana, I'm gonna go back to something that you kind of mentioned when you responded to my first question, and that was around you mentioned entrepreneurship, which is something that I've kind of been thinking about throughout the summit as well, because while social entrepreneurship is obviously, the leading the way in terms of, making these changes through the power of business. One thing I wonder is about what's something that maybe, or a piece of advice or some takeaways that people who are actively working in a business that isn't considered a social enterprise, ways that they can maybe embrace that entrepreneurial spirit for the sake of social enterprise and do it in sort of an entrepreneurship way. Like, what are some foundational steps, maybe aside from the planning piece, like maybe you have a good idea, you kind of create a plan about it, but what are some ways to sort of address that in a team context or maybe outside the organization, and like, what's the best way to get yourself equipped to do something like that?
I'll say two small things and then I'll pass it to the group, but two small things. I think one is that just like in entrepreneurship, how do you think about small strategic experiments that are going to really validate what you're doing? And in particular, like understanding what your organization's mission and objectives are. Are there ways for you to kind of bring in resources or partnerships or folks to work with that can validate little components of a bigger picture that you have? And again, like an entrepreneur, you're holding a vision and then you're trying to kind of build out around that. I think that that's kind of a tactic. And then there's a concept that I learned from a woman, her name's Frances Wesley. She wrote a book called Getting to Maybe, which is on social innovation. And there's a concept in that book called powerful strangers. And so who is it that you can engage that might actually have authority or resources or viewpoints that might help you advance that mission? And I think that concept kind of really has resonated with me in terms of who might you work with that's outside of your outside of the usual suspects. And I think that that is a powerful concept that translates into the entrepreneurship world as well.
I'll just build on that. I think that's a really interesting piece because there's so many cool things that happen even just within a team, right? Everybody has different skills, everybody has different interests, and also people have different experiences. And so talking to the team using those pieces can be really powerful. But then also the piece of you kind of might all be working in a social organization. You might be all really passionate about the same thing. So then also bringing in voices of people who maybe are going to call you on some of the assumptions that you have, or what has worked, what has not worked in the past. And we talk about them as, we call them friendly wise skeptics. But I think that's also another really powerful piece. And sometimes those people aren't going to be in your organization. Actually, a lot of the time we'll go. They might not be in your organization. There can be some pretty skeptical people on your team as well. But I think that's a really powerful piece is using the team skills and leveraging those things, leveraging their connections and their experiences, but then also getting out of your little bubble and understanding what has worked in other organizations, what hasn't worked, and getting some feedback on that can be really powerful too.
And I think with that, we say thank you so much to our panel, to our audience for being here, for having been here the last 2 days. But we're not done yet. There's still a little bit to go tomorrow. There's the Pivot on Purpose case competition. The finals are available to watch to everyone in the audience through the Fleetwood platform, which you've been using over the last few days. But just before we go, I'll just do a round table for any last thoughts. Jordana, please.
I just want to say thank you to the team for hosting and for this kind of awesome pop experience.
Yeah, over to you.
First, I thank the audience. I can't believe we had 40 or so on like a Friday afternoon or whatever. But just to add an added plug for Saturday, at the around, actually, Alya can confirm the time, but there's actually a panel of 3 to 5 social entrepreneurs who started out as student social entrepreneurs and then have evolved their venture. So these are going to be people who have like just amazing stories, who have actually lived it. So it's not theory, they've actually done it. So you may want to, based on a lot of the questions here about how to actually do stuff, that may be a phenomenal panel for you to check out.
Tomorrow at 2:30 p.m. And then right after that, we'll go into the announcement of who won the case competition. So there's lots happening tomorrow afternoon. Brittni.
My dog just woke up because he obviously heard that we were doing closing remarks. So if you hear weird noises, sorry. But what I would say is I just want to thank the audience across all of POP for all of the questions that they've asked and they've posed on the way, because as people who work in this space every day, you kind of get into your bubble, right? You guys are our friendly white skeptics. So bringing in sort of the new perspectives is so powerful. And then now we can take that back into our own programming and the work that we do, and hopefully work with you guys or just work with other organizations that are exploring social entrepreneurship in more relatable and applicable ways. So we very much appreciate everybody taking part and being active in these conversations.
Going last, the problem is everyone's kind of reiterated everything that I already wanted to say. So I just have kind of 2 closing comments. One, when we were talking before, I had a thought that maybe we need to run an MLAs series that is built with a panelist of social entrepreneurs who have been through this, because I feel like they can answer some of these questions far better than I could. But the second one was to Brittni's point, which is I love hearing these questions, even if I can't always answer them really well. I take them back and I give them thorough thought after, because in the work that I do, it's really, I want to be able to answer those questions. And I want you to not have to necessarily come to a panel to get the answer to that question. I want those questions to be answered in other places. So thank you for asking them in this, because we don't have a lot of opportunities to engage in that way. And I do take all of those questions very, like I take them and I mull them and I'm like, how can we better answer this so that that information is readily available without a panel system. So keep asking them, and thank you everyone. So, and it's been lovely. So thank you to the organizers of POP.
Thank you. I love that final thought. We want to make all this information accessible, and sorry, it has to be through a webinar, but we're trying to figure out ways to bring you to it. And that's why we opted for POP to be a virtual conference and free, so that anyone across Canada, either in English or French, it would be available to them anywhere. And we have members from Qatar, which is awesome. With that, thank you for re-energizing me at the end of the day. It's 4:30 here. And I look forward to seeing some of you tomorrow, hopefully. And I hope our paths cross again soon.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, everyone.